Order, order. We come to question the Secretary of State for the Home Department, David Pinto-Duschinsky.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Number one, please.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, fraud devastates lives, and this government is determined to meet this challenge head-on, including through the new expanded fraud strategy that we promised in our manifesto. We are working with law enforcement and with industry to better protect the public and demanding that the tech companies go further and faster to protect the consumers at risk of fraud on their platforms.
Pinto-Duschinsky.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for his answer. Online scams are an important source of concern in my constituency in Hendon. A number of my constituents have been targeted and one lost £40,000 to an online scam. Many of these scams originate overseas. What discussions has the Minister had with the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology about tackling online scams and about working with other countries to crack down on those coming from abroad?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raises an important issue, not least that the vast majority of these scams are perpetrated by criminal gangs based overseas. We need the support of overseas governments and agencies and the cooperation of the tech firms to prevent fraud taking place on their platforms. The Noble Lord Hanson will be meeting tech firms next month to confirm what action has been taken and working across government, including with partners in DCIT and with others. We will not hesitate to take further action where necessary.
David Hinds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was disappointing in the January figures to see that fraud had risen again after it had been coming down, but I commend the government on proceeding with the Payment Services Amendment Regulations 2024 to slow down payments where there is a reasonable suspicion of fraudulent activity. And can the Minister say what effects he believes that change will make?
Well, I think the Right Honourable Gentleman does make an important point. He's right. The latest statistics show that the year ending September 2024, there were 3.9 million incidents. That's 1 in 15 people becoming a victim, which demonstrates the urgent need for action. The government is taking action. The Home Secretary, the Chancellor and the Secretary of State for DCIT recently wrote to the tech and teleco companies urging them to go faster and further on fraud. We expect them to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Settlement in the UK is a privilege, not an automatic entitlement. And there are already a range of periods of time that people are required to spend in the UK before they qualify for settlement. The number of people granted settlement each year will reflect the number of migrants coming to the UK in earlier years. This government is determined to bring control to the immigration system and to bring net migration down, and we keep all our policies under review.
There is clearly a cost to doing nothing about the current indefinite leave to remain policy, and a recent Centre for Policy Studies report estimates that net lifetime cost was £234 billion for those expected to be granted ILR over the next 5 years. What is the Minister's assessment of that cost?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I may gently say to the honourable member that the number of settlement grants grew by almost a third in the final year that his party were in government compared to 2023, and that we will take absolutely no lessons from a Tory party and a shadow Home Secretary who completely lost control of our borders, allowing net migration to quadruple to a record high of nearly 1 million, while dangerous boat crossings soared.
Dr. Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Only those refugees with a proven case that they would be at harm if they returned home are given indefinite leave to remain in this country, but 30,000 people were last year. They won't leave the United Kingdom to return to the bombs and the dictators, but without a route to citizenship, they will find it harder to get a job to support their families or to get a mortgage or to have a say in their local communities. Will the Minister meet with myself and other MPs concerned about the new guidance on naturalisation to talk about how we can properly support integration in the UK?
I thank my honourable friend for her question, and she will know that for many generations, refugees who have arrived on resettlement and who have settled in the UK have been able to apply for British citizenship if they meet the conditions, and that continues, Mr. Speaker, to be the case. The UK must always do its bit to support those who are fleeing persecution, but we are also clear that we must do all we can to prevent people making dangerous boat crossings, risking their lives in the arms of criminal gangs.
To Katie Lamb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we have heard, according to the Centre for Policy Studies, over 800,000 migrants from the last 5 years could soon claim indefinite leave to remain, or ILR. In NHS care, benefits, social housing and more, this will cost £234 billion. That's nearly 6 years of defence spending, or almost all taxpayers' income tax receipts for a year. Will the Minister commit to extending the qualifying period for ILR, or will she accept that the consequence of her policy is a liability for the public of hundreds of billions of pounds?
Mr. Speaker, I still am quite flabbergasted by the questions that the Conservatives ask in this House. A party that saw net migration more than quadruple to record levels. She will know that the Prime Minister has also pledged a white paper on reducing net migration. That was the end of last year, and work is underway on considering a range of proposals, including how we support better integration and employability of refugees.
Williams.
Question number 3, Mr. Speaker.
Home Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, can I also support your words on the people of Ukraine on this third anniversary of the invasion, including those who are here in the UK on the Homes for Ukraine scheme. With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll group this question with question 5. Too many communities are blighted by antisocial behaviour, which has increased over the last 10 years, while neighbourhood policing was heavily cut. That's why this government's plan for change means putting neighbourhood police back on the beat in our town centres and our communities, and stronger powers in our crime and policing bill to be introduced tomorrow to tackle off-road bikes, repeat offenders and shop theft.
David Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mark Porter is a community leader who runs Kidsgrove Lads and Dads. Around 400 young people play football at Birchwood Fields every weekend, yet the football pitches are constantly damaged by off-road bikes. The same happens at Birchwood golf courses and also across estates like Mill Hill in Tunstall. So can the Home Secretary outline what steps will be taken to tackle the impact of off-road bikes on our communities in Stoke-on-Trent North and Kidsgrove?
My honourable friend makes a really important point. Some of these off-road bikes are a total nightmare. They drive communities up the wall. It's the harassment and the intimidation that they can also cause. And that is why we are strengthening the powers, because at the moment the police have to provide repeat warnings before they can take action to seize these bikes. We think they should be able to seize these antisocial bikes straight away.
Alice MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Antisocial behaviour can come in a variety of forms. Norfolk Police have recently made addressing safety concerns around e-bikes and e-scooters a priority. In just one day, they reportedly seized 12 illegally modified bikes in Norwich. I welcome this crackdown, but speeding e-bikes and e-scooters are a real menace in our city centre. Can the Home Secretary expand on the measures we will take to tackle speeding and also illegally modified e-bikes and e-scooters?
My honourable friend is right to raise this in her community, because this is causing havoc and can be really threatening for people in the local community as well. That's why we're all strengthening the law in supporting police to take stronger action on off-road bikes, and also introducing respect orders so that we can also ban repeat offenders from town centres and tackle the antisocial behaviour that has blighted communities for far too long.
Sarah Wilson.
Much, Mr. Speaker. Antisocial behaviour is not just a problem in our town centres but also in our parks. And that's why my constituents are extremely concerned about plans to axe the Specialist Royal Parks Policing Unit and subsume it into community support teams, given the £450 million shortfall that the Met Police faces. This means Bushy Park in my constituency will undoubtedly get less police coverage. So what assurances can the Home Secretary give my constituents that they won't see fewer police officers in our communities and our parks?
Well, this government is clear we need to get more police back on the beat. We have seen the number of PCSOs halved Over the last 10-15 years, we've seen a big drop in the number of neighbourhood police officers on the beat, and that is why we're increasing neighbourhood policing with an additional £200 million investment in neighbourhood policing next year, part of up to £1.1 billion additional funding for police forces across the country next year.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Home Secretary will be aware that councils up and down the country have real problems with nuisance tenants creating mayhem and committing crimes and making residents' lives a misery. So does she agree with me that these nuisance tenants should have a one-strike and out policy? And if they keep creating these problems, they should be out and the local authorities have no duty to rehouse them?
Well, we need stronger action against antisocial behaviour. That includes whether that is havoc in town centres, whether that is off-road bikes, or whether that is nuisance neighbours making the community's lives a misery. But that is why this government is increasing neighbourhood policing and also giving the police and local communities much stronger powers to crack down on antisocial behaviour so that we can take back our communities from the vandals, thieves and those who are making other people's lives a misery.
Jessica Bourne.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Like my honourable friend, constituents consistently raise the issue of antisocial use of e-scooters and e-bikes, and I certainly welcome on their behalf the measures in the Crime and Policing Bill to seize them. But can ministers also talk to the Department of Transport about updating the legislation, particularly around e-scooters, because their usage has exploded but legislation hasn't kept pace?
Well, I can tell my honourable friend we are working with the Department of Transport. We do need to ensure that communities can be kept safe, that proper safety standards are met, and also that antisocial behaviour is tackled. I have also seen with Staffordshire Police the work that they are doing using drones, for example, in order to follow those who are on dangerous off-road bikes so that they can take action.
Sir Ashley Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Home Secretary agree with me that it would be easier for the police to tackle antisocial behaviour if they had more support for special constables? The number of special constables has fallen in recent years, particularly since the pandemic. So would she agree to look at amending the Employment Rights Act so that special constables are brought within Section 50 of that Act?
So I do agree with the honourable member that special constables can play a really important role, and their numbers have dropped by around 2/3 over the last 14 years. I think that is damaging, and we want to see an increase in the special constables, and we are working with police forces on how best to do that, to make sure that they can also play their part both on the streets in neighbourhood teams but also supporting other specialist aspects of the work that the police do.
Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Greater Manchester has one of the highest crime rates in the country, with many suffering as a result of antisocial behaviour. But this weekend we saw police officers knocking on the door of a grandmother because she dared to criticise a Labour councillor for his role in the pensioner hating WhatsApp scandal. Does the Home Secretary agree that this is a waste of police time?
Well, this government has been clear about the important focus of policing needs to be on the neighbourhood crimes that blight our communities. That's why we are increasing neighbourhood policing, when I'm afraid his party slashed the number of neighbourhood police on the beat, so we lost thousands of neighbourhood police in our communities, and why we are also focusing the police on serious violence. That's what tomorrow's legislation will be, is to focus on tackling serious violence and also making sure that we deal with the most serious crimes in our communities, something that too often, time and again, the party that presided over a 61% increase in shoplifting alone in the last 2 years they were in power has failed repeatedly to do.
Alex McIntyre.
Question number 4, please, Mr. Speaker.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government is determined to tackle the scourge of domestic abuse wherever it is found, and that is why we have already announced bold measures to transform the policing response to these devastating crimes. Last week, I am proud to say that we embedded the first domestic abuse specialists in 999 control rooms in 5 police forces under Reneem's law, and we plan to equip forces everywhere with the tools they need to crack down on perpetrators and keep victims safe, including in Gloucester.
Alex McIntyre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for her answer to that question and for all the work that she has done over many, many years to champion victims and survivors of domestic abuse. But as she will know, one of the biggest challenges facing survivors and victims of domestic abuse in Gloucester is the financial implications of fleeing that abuse. So will she agree to meet with me to discuss my 10-minute rule bill to introduce safe leave for victims of domestic abuse and violence? Thank you.
I am grateful to the kind words of my honourable friend and for his commitment to supporting victims. He will be aware that his private member's bill will be the responsibility of the Department for Business and Trade, but I would of course be willing to meet with him and them to discuss it.
Chair of the Select Committee, Dame Caroline.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The recent NAO report on the government response to violence against women and girls, which of course includes domestic abuse, made a number of recommendations. My committee is going to be looking at this issue as well, but I wonder whether the Minister could make any comments about what the government's response will be to those recommendations and how she will make sure that domestic abuse is tackled across the country, including in Gloucester.
I was waiting for the Gloucester. As the Right Honourable Lady will know, that the NAO report is largely based on the period of office of the previous government, and it makes some very clear recommendations that I have. It would be premature of me to say, but the violence against women and girls strategy that will be published by this government in early summer will undoubtedly be looking to the NAO recommendations.
Harris.
Question 6, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
The trafficking of women and girls for sexual exploitation is a horrific crime, and the government works closely with law enforcement to tackle the drivers of this offending and to target prolific perpetrators. This includes through operational intensification initiatives aimed at tackling modern slavery threats. The Online Safety Act sets out priority offences, including sexual exploitation and human trafficking offences. Starting from the 17th of March, in scope, companies must adopt systems and processes to address these offences.
Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for her response. But I would say that in 2023, the then Home Affairs Select Committee recommended that pimping websites be outlawed. The previous government took no action, allowing sex traffickers to continue to legally exploit their victims online. I've since been made aware of further online exploitation, with websites allowing men to rate and review the women for whom they're paying for sex, including admissions of trafficking, underage sex and rape. Can the Minister share what action this government will take to protect victims of online sexual exploitation?
I thank my honourable friend, and like her, am horrified that such practices should be allowed to continue. Online platforms have a duty to assess the risk of illegal harms on their services, with a deadline of the 16th of March 2025, subject to the codes of practice completing the parliamentary process on the 17th of March. Online platforms will need to take safety measures set out in codes of practice and use other effective measures to protect users from illegal content like that which she speaks. And the activity, if they fail, will face significant penalties. As she might imagine, I will be keeping a close eye on that.
Well, Mohammed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Secretary of State inform the House what measures she is taking to address the record backlog of court cases in the UK, which, as the Chief Inspector of the Crown Prosecution Service and Serious Fraud Office has warned, is on target to hit 100,000? In particular, can she comment on the call for changes to be made in the way court cases are being prioritised, which at present is resulting in victims of serious crimes, including sexual trafficking, exploitation and rape, face years-long waits for trials, while less serious crimes are being prioritised ahead in the queue?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and I also recognise the parlous state of our criminal justice system that we inherited, that has led to some rape victims and sexual violence victims waiting years on end. I noted the Shadow Justice Secretary had only just noticed this failing now that he had a shadow in front of his name, even though his government presided over that failing for a decade. We will, part of the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, which I work very in concert with the Ministry of Justice on, is absolutely about ensuring this is sorted.
Shadow Minister Mike Vickers. I've got to get through.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Fiona from Bradford was failed numerous times by social services and local police after suffering horrific sexual abuse at the hands of gangs of men whilst in a care home. Bradford's local authority have shamefully sought to block a local inquiry into the issue. In Fiona's own words, the government can't just leave it down to the local councils to decide if they're going to be investigated. They're going to have to enforce it. Will the Home Secretary reconsider a statutory inquiry into grooming gangs? And if not, how will she guarantee that cases like this can never be allowed to happen again?
What I would say is that I am working with victims all across the country to ensure, and as has already been announced, that cold cases like the one that the Shadow Minister has referred to will be able to be reopened. The Government has invested an extra £2.5 million in the task force to ensure that this can happen, and will be working with local authorities in the country to make sure that the failures of the past are not repeated.
Vicky Slade.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Question 7.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for her question? Through the County Lines programme, we continue to target exploitative drug-dealing gangs wherever they operate, including in rural areas, as part of our efforts to dismantle the organised crime groups behind this trade. Since the Government took office, the County Lines programme has closed over 400 drug lines running across communities in England and Wales, and we're also committed in our manifesto to go after the gangs who lure young people into violence and crime, and at the weekend announced that we will be delivering a new offence of child criminal exploitation in the forthcoming Crime and Policing Bill.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's well known that rural and seaside areas are targeted by these drug gangs, and Escape Line has assessed that up to 70,000 young people, some as young as 6, are being trafficked. In my constituency, I've recently dealt with young girls provided drugs by trusted adults in dance schools with no action because they're not seen as CRB-checked people, and vulnerable adults being controlled in their own homes with no response at all from local police because resources are directed elsewhere. My small towns are simply not being seen as a priority. How can I offer reassurance to my community that those small towns are not being forgotten?
Well, the Honourable Lady makes a very important point, and I would just say to her that she made the comment about resources. There is specific resources available to police forces to surge that resource into tackling county lines. And I know that her police force, which is Dorset, has in the past applied for that funding. So I would encourage her to perhaps have a conversation with the PCC and the Chief Constable about what more can be done in terms of getting that resource into the towns that she talks about.
Dr Ross Savage.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Question number 8.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Member for her question. The 2025-26 final police funding settlement provides funding of up to £19.6 billion for the policing system in England and Wales. That's an increase of £1.1 billion when compared to 24-25. Of this, Gloucestershire will receive up to £168.2 million, an increase of over £10 million, and that includes the £1.5 million to kickstart the recruitment of additional neighbourhood police officers and PCSOs in Gloucestershire.
Dr Ross Savage.
I thank the Minister for her response. My constituency of the South Cotswolds straddles 2 counties, Gloucestershire and Wiltshire, both of which are large and both of which languish near the bottom of the league table of funding for constabularies. Can the Minister assure my constituents that even though their constabularies are saying they're going to have to cut their numbers despite the modest rise in funding, that their crimes will be addressed on a timely basis?
Well, I would just say to the Honourable Lady that more money is going into policing, particularly around the neighbourhood policing guarantee that this government promised in its manifesto. That £200 million to kickstart
the recruitment of the police officers, PCSOs and specials into all of our communities. I take her point about the funding formula, which I think she's referring to, and how that affects the two forces that straddle her constituency. And I would say that we're going into a spending review at the moment. I know that officials have been meeting, particularly with Gloucestershire Constabulary, to talk about the financial situation, and we will obviously keep that under review as we work towards the spending review.
President.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like Gloucestershire, Essex Police is receiving additional funding this year. In fact, we're getting increasing funding of £27 million. Despite this, the front desk at Harlow Police Station is under threat. Would the Minister agree with me that with the additional funding, actually police services in Harlow in Essex should be increasing, not decreasing? And any proposals to do so is down to historic underfunding by the previous government.
Well, I'm very pleased that Essex has got the increase in funding that it has, and I would just gently point out the decisions around how those resources are used are decisions for the Police and Crime Commissioner and the Chief Constable. But overall, there is over £1.1 billion going into policing over and above what the previous government put in 24-25.
Dr. Peter Prince.
Question number 9, please.
Mr. Speaker, this weekend's horrific attack in Malhotra in France has again reminded us of the threat from terrorists and from Islamist extremism, which can strike at any time. I have spoken to the French Interior Minister this morning to offer them our support and any assistance that they need, and we will continue to work with our European colleagues and the Five Eyes partnerships to tackle these threats, both internationally and here in the UK.
Dr. Peter Prince.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sadly, the misappropriation of religious belief to justify acts of terror and intimidation has become familiar across the world. We've seen the minds of too many of our young people corrupted by online peddlers of hate. So what action is this government taking to tackle radicalisation at a time when xenophobia and intolerance are being promoted for political purposes?
Well, my honourable friend is right that terrorists do not speak for any faith, and interfaith relationships are an important part of developing stronger communities. But we are also clear that the government and across society, we have to do more to prevent radicalisation, and particularly the growing numbers of young people being drawn into terrorism, both Islamist extremism and extreme right-wing threats. And that is why tomorrow we will introduce new youth diversion orders through our crime and policing bill to give the police new powers to divert young people away from terrorism.
Sir Julian.
Whilst I welcome what the Home Secretary is saying about the need to divert and prevent homegrown terrorism, does she accept that there's a pattern of terrorism emerging in continental Europe of undocumented migrants going into countries and then committing terrorist acts? Does she agree with me that it is very difficult for the authorities to be able to prevent anything of that sort if undocumented illegal migrants are released into society when they arrive on these shores as well?
Well, we're clear that we need to tackle extremist and terror threats wheresoever they are found. That includes making sure that we have strengthened border security. It's why we have put forward new counter-terror style powers around people smuggling and trafficking to strengthen our border security, but is also why we need to tackle particularly the radicalisation that we are seeing online, which is where we are also seeing young people being drawn into extremist and terror threats. Wheresoever it is found, we need strong action in place to keep our country safe.
Shadow Minister Katie Lamb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fighting terrorism, the Security Minister has rightly said Islamism is the foremost threat we face. Its danger lies not just in physical violence, but in the intolerance it embodies and the intimidation it relies upon. So will the Home Secretary give a clear answer to this? Should it be a criminal offence to desecrate a Quran or any holy text? Yes or no?
We are made clear that the primary domestic terrorist threat comes from Islamist terrorism at 3/4 of the MI5 caseload and 64% of those in custody for terrorism-connected offences. That is followed by extreme right-wing terrorism, which also covers around 1/4 of the MI5 caseload, and we already have a framework of legislation in place to ensure that we can deal with the kinds of threats to our cohesion as well as to our communities and the kinds of dangerous threats that we face.
Ruth Cabray.
Number 10, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with your permission, I will group this response with question 18. In the last year of the previous government, shop theft reached a record high and violence and abuse towards retail workers increased at an unacceptable level. This government will not tolerate these crimes, and as a central part of our Safer Streets mission, we are committed to introducing a new standalone offence of assaulting a retail worker and ending the effective immunity for shop theft of goods under £200 because there is no such thing as low-level crime.
Ruth Cabray.
Thank you. I thank the Minister for her answer. I was recently contacted by a constituent who works in a small high street supermarket, and he and his colleagues have frequently been violently attacked by shoplifters. So I wonder what else the Minister can say about what the government can do to protect shop workers themselves.
Well, it's appalling to hear about cases such as the ones in my honourable friend's constituency, and I think, like everyone else across the House, I'm really very taken by how commonplace the violence and abuse against shop workers has sadly become. And the government has made absolutely clear that anybody and everybody who is going to work has the right to feel safe on the job. And we're not going to tolerate the criminality that we've seen in recent times. And that's why, following the years of campaigning from Usdaw and the Co-op, the Labour government will finally deliver a standalone criminal offence of assaulting a retail worker.
Stella James.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Shop workers in Doncaster have told me time and again that they're fed up with the amount of shoplifting going on and the antisocial behaviour that goes along with it, including threats and sometimes physical violence. This kind of crime needs to be crushed. I'm pleased to hear there's going to be a standalone offence included in the legislation this week, but can the Minister confirm that the police will have the clout to be able to enforce the law and make sure we eliminate this kind of activity?
My honourable friend makes a very important point, and that's why our commitment to neighbourhood policing and putting the police officers, the PCSOs and the specials back into our neighbourhoods, into our communities, into the high streets and the town centres will enable them to take the action that we all want to see in terms of the antisocial behaviour that my honourable friend talks about.
Josh Babaranda.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the best ways of tackling retail crime and associated antisocial behaviour among young people is through targeted preventative work with at-risk pupils in schools. An example is via the Guidance and Welfare Unit at Cavendish School in Eastbourne that was set up by my former head teacher, Mr. Fitzpatrick, who's in the public gallery today, along with my former head of year, Mrs. Fitzpatrick, who is in the head in the gallery as well. So will the Minister join me in congratulating inspirational teachers like them for their critical safeguarding and prevention work with young people across Eastbourne and beyond?
Well, I don't want to get into trouble, but I would like to congratulate Mr and Mrs Fitzpatrick for the work that they've done, and we know how important that early preventative work is, and that's why this government is also committed to our prevention partnerships, identifying those young people on the cusp of getting involved in criminality and diverting them and putting the resources into making sure that they make much better choices for their lives.
Tom Gordon.
Mr. Speaker, Harrogate has a wealth of independent stores that attract people from across the region to the town, including, unfortunately, shoplifters too. I've been speaking with the Harrogate bid about what they can do to help tackle shoplifting, but they have a increasingly better relationship now with North Yorkshire Police, and I'm wondering what steps the Minister might be taking to encourage North Yorkshire Police and other police organisations to work with local community and business organisations to crack down on shoplifting.
The honourable gentleman makes a very important point, and in fact I was visiting North Yorkshire last week, And one of the issues there is about how well they are working with communities, with the retail sector, to actually start to tackle some of the issues around retail crime. And I just want to also say that there is £7 million over the next 3 years going in to support the police tackling retail crime through the specialist team OPAL, which is the National Police Intelligence Unit. And that's looking at the serious organised criminal gangs who are now involved in retail theft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Number 11, please.
It's me again. Can I thank my honourable friend for this question? The government is committed to tackling rural crime. We have recognised the devastating consequences it can have on communities and the agricultural sector. Under our reforms, rural areas will be safeguarded through tougher measures to clamp down on antisocial behaviour, strengthen neighbourhood policing and action to prevent fly tipping.
Antisocial behaviour in Turley, a small village in my constituency, has had a significant impact on the community. Small rural communities like these often feel overlooked and struggle to have their voices heard when it comes to policing and public safety. Will the government ensure that rural communities like Turley receive the named police officer guarantee so they have a dedicated point of contact for policing and for support?
Yes, and my honourable friend raises a really important point about those small parts of larger rural communities and how they can feel that the neighbourhood policing guarantee that we've made will be providing them with the reassurance. So the named officer, absolutely. And also, I think it's worth recognising the use of things like WhatsApp groups in big rural areas where intelligence can be fed into the police. That can also be really helpful for those communities to feel safe.
That's expensive.
Speaker, look, policing in rural areas is increasingly complex, but rural constabularies receive much less funding than inner city ones. I know she'll jump on this opportunity to complain about the last government, but will she at least take a moment to commit to publishing the methodology behind the funding formula and open a conversation about fairer funding for rural police forces?
Well, the honourable gentleman is right that I am going to say that the funding formula was introduced by the previous government, I think in 2011, and they had 2 goes at trying to actually update it and didn't do anything about it. We have been in government for, I think, 7 months now. This is what we have inherited. In a lot of areas, we've inherited things that we wouldn't necessarily have wanted to have inherited. What I've said before to the House is that we are going to be looking at police reform going forward, and part of that conversation will be around financial issues.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 12.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I'll group this response with question 14. We are continuing to reduce the use of asylum hotels from the peak which was reached under the previous government, when more than 400 hotels were in use across the country at a cost of £9 million being spent every day. We're determined to end the use of hotels over time as part of our wider objective to cut the cost of asylum accommodation and restore order to our immigration system.
Tom Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Asylum seekers are forced to live in limbo. Bournemouth hotels cost the taxpayer eye-watering sums, as we just heard, and everyone is stuck in a situation that nobody wants. I've written to BCP Council to express opposition to additional asylum hotels being established within my constituency of Bournemouth East. But I'd like to know from the Minister, can she outline how the Home Office has reallocated resources after the election to speed up the closure of hotels and the processing of asylum applications, and to turn a page on 14 years of Conservative failure?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're determined to end hotel usage as part of our objective to cut the costs of asylum accommodation, and the key element of this is clearing the asylum backlog and increasing returns so that the system operates swiftly, firmly and fairly.
Well, I'm afraid, Minister, determination won't quite cut it, will it? Pensioners in North Dorset will want to know that having been deprived of their winter fuel allowance, and farmers now being faced by a massive tax burden. How are you actually how's the Minister going to reduce the cost of asylum hotels, which is, as she says, eye-wateringly high, but the action and her words are not apparently matching?
Mr. Speaker, we have to deal with a chaotic system which we inherited from the party opposite, and we are doing this in various ways. One of the big things that we are trying to do is speed up the system and end the backlog so we can get people out of hotels.
Gregory Stafford.
Question 13, sir.
Minister.
The government is determined to act and ensure that people feel safe on our streets, and that's why on the 6th of February the Home Secretary brought together law enforcement and the mobile phone industry to see what more could be done to break the business model of mobile phone theft and to ensure that there is stronger collaboration across those agencies to crack down on the criminal networks who are operating in this trade.
Gregory Stafford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst in previous times mobile phone theft was seen as an urban issue, it is increasing in our rural towns and villages, as evidenced in my postbag over the last couple of weeks. So can I ask the Minister what discussions she's having with colleagues in the Department of Justice to ensure those who are repeated perpetrators of this crime face a custodial sentence?
Well, I think it's important to note that whilst there's a concentration, particularly in the Metropolitan Police area around phone thefts, there are phone thefts happening around the country, and I think what's being put forward are using the best practice, those forces that are actually starting to tackle the problem. I'm thinking particularly of West Midlands, using the good practice there and spreading it to all police forces. There will be another meeting in 3 months' time of the task force that I talked about, the summit that was held. And I think the issue that the Honourable Gentleman raises, I will certainly speak to my colleagues in the Ministry of Justice about.
Question 16, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the Home Office works closely with other government departments and operational agencies to strengthen the UK's defences against state threats. This includes continuing to implement measures contained in the National Security Act of 2023, which will make the UK a harder target for those states which seek to conduct hostile acts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for that answer. Hostile states are using unknowing security officials here in the UK to undermine our national security and conceal their activities. The Director General of the MI5 has said that Russia and Iran are increasingly using this tactic. Now, I absolutely welcome the Home Office guidance, which allows security organisations to carry out effective due diligence. But can I ask the Minister what else his department is doing with the security industry to ensure that our country is protected from these hostile state threats?
My honourable friend, not just for his question, but also referencing the recent guidance published by the Home Office. The guidance was a crucial first step in upskilling security professionals on the risks they might encounter from state actors. We are following this up with targeted engagement events across the sector, including attending upcoming industry conferences to ensure that the key messages are well understood and that we can have an ongoing dialogue with the sector around the handling of these threats.
James Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister very much for his answer? When you look at hostile state threats, you can't ignore terrorism groups from the right and from the left in this great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. They work with some of those hostile states. Can I ask the Minister this? What's been done to ensure that the paramilitary groups across this United Kingdom are taken on and the hostile states that they represent for their own motivations can be addressed directly? Thank you so much.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman makes an important point, as he always does. I mean, I can say to him, a threat is a threat, regardless of the direction from which it comes. We take all of them incredibly seriously, and we work around the clock with the police and the operational agencies to keep the public safe wherever the threat might originate from.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Lisa Smart.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Strong encryption is vital for everyone's security. But last week, Apple pulled its advanced data protection services in the UK. This was after the Home Office reportedly demanded backdoor access to its UK customers' encrypted data. Liberal Democrats have long argued that investigatory powers must be proportionate. Any way in for security services can be exploited by criminal gangs or indeed hostile states to target innocent people. Mr. Speaker, rights and security go hand in hand. So what steps is the Minister taking to ensure our national security and civil liberties are properly protected? And why does the government believe that Apple's UK customers do not deserve the same privacy rights as every other customer in the rest of the world?
Well, I hope the Honourable Lady will understand that I can't comment on operational matters, and it would not be appropriate for me to either confirm or deny the existence of any notices under the Investigatory Powers Act of 2016. This has been a long-standing position of successive governments for obvious reasons of national security. What I can say, though, is that the suggestion that privacy and security are at odds is not correct. We can and must have both. The Investigatory Powers Act contains robust safeguards and independent oversight to protect privacy and ensure that data is only obtained on an exceptional basis and only when it is necessary and proportionate to do so.
Come to topicals. Greg Smith.
Topical number 1, sir.
Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, my son didn't stand a chance. Those were the heartbreaking words of Pooja Kanda, whose teenage son Ronan was fatally stabbed in 2022. His teenage killers were able to buy multiple dangerous weapons online without any proper checks. Following Pooja's campaigning, we are introducing Ronan's Law, which includes tightening the rules for online retailers, increasing the maximum penalty for selling weapons to under 18s, introducing much more stringent ID checks at the point of purchase and delivery, and I thank Commander Stephen Clayman for his crucial review in this area that underpins these reforms and pay tribute to the Kanda family. We need to do everything in our power to prevent other families suffering from this terrible knife crime.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thames Valley Police are £1.9 million down this year because of the flawed formula after a pay award is given to distributing funds to police forces. When will this historic anomaly be fixed?
Well, I'll just point out to him that his party had 14 years to address all of the things he is so concerned about now. This government has increased the funding for policing by up to £1.1 billion next year, including £200 million for neighbourhood policing, to start reversing the huge cuts in neighbourhood policing that we've seen on our streets, including in Thames Valley and right across the country, because we need to get police back on the street.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for her previous answers and her commitment to reducing the numbers of asylum claimants in the UK. As the Minister will know, the UK is spending 27% of ODA on housing asylum claimants and almost double that of the OECD average. As our overseas spend was cut by the previous government, the question is, does she agree with me that in order to reduce the number of claimants coming to the UK government should increase the spend of building peace and security abroad?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend is right to say that asylum costs make up the bulk of Home Office spend classified as ODA spending, and that we're committed to reducing those asylum costs, including by ending the use of hotels, which will mean we can return that ODA resource so that it can be used upstream to prevent migratory flows happening in the first place.
Right. Shadow Home Secretary Criswell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Border security is fundamental, but between the July election and yesterday, 25,135 people illegally and dangerously crossed the English Channel, a 28% increase on the same period 12 months earlier. Does the Home Secretary now regret ignoring the National Crime Agency's advice that law enforcement alone is not enough and that a removals deterrent is needed?
I just perhaps point out to the Shadow Home Secretary that the figure he refers to, when the Conservatives were in government, we saw that many people arrive in the space of just over 100 days because they completely lost control of our borders and let criminal gangs take hold along the channel. And 84,000 people arrived on small boats, while the Rwanda policy that he somehow wants to reintroduce managed to send just 4 volunteers. We have increased returns by over 20% to 19,000. That is important, but I hope he will explain why he voted against counter-terrorism powers to go after smuggler gangs.
Well, she talks about the Rwanda scheme. Of course, it never even started. As she well knows, the first flight was due to take off after the election, but she cancelled it. And in relation to returns, she mentions returns a moment ago and how they've gone up. What she failed to mention, Mr. Speaker, was the vast majority of those, of course, did not enter the country by small boat. The number of small boat returns went down after this government came to office and represent only 4% of people crossing the English Channel. Does she really think letting 96% of illegal immigrants stay here is going to deter anybody?
To say to the Shadow Home Secretary, the Rwanda scheme ran for 2 years. It was running for 2 years. Exactly. All they managed to do...
Please, just let's show a little bit more restraint. When you ask the question, at least wait for the answer. Home Secretary.
They ran for 2 years, spent £700 million of taxpayers' money to return just 4 people. And in the period in which he was in government, 128,000 people arrived on small boats. A tiny percentage of them ever returned, even though those numbers included 12,000 Albanians. This government is having to sort this chaos out, but his party, again, fails to support counter-terrorism powers against smuggler and trafficking gangs, siding with the criminal smuggler gangs instead of the people of Britain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's illegal to post a prostitution advert in a phone box, yet the very same advert can be freely posted online by a pimping website. Websites that make it as easy to order a woman to exploit as it is to order a takeaway. Does the Minister agree with me that we must urgently update our anti-pimping laws to make it a criminal offence to enable or to profit from the prostitution of another person, online or offline?
I thank my honourable friend for raising this important point. The government is clear that online platforms are a significant enabler of sexual exploitation and must be responsible and held accountable for the content on their sites, including taking proactive steps to prevent their sites being used by criminals. We are implementing the Online Safety Act, which sets a priority offences, including sexual exploitation and human trafficking.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Lisa Smart.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. On a recent visit to Marple Sixth Form College, I was reminded that the last Conservative government abandoned young people and our economy by trashing our relationship with Europe. And so I was delighted to see recent reports in the Times that the Prime Minister will offer a youth mobility scheme in negotiations with the EU, a common-sense approach that will give our young people opportunities and help grow our economy. So will the Minister support delivering the best possible deal for young people here in the UK by extending a youth mobility scheme to the EU?
Well, as the front bench spokesperson for Liberal Democrats knows, that is not our plan, and we are clear that net migration needs to come down. It quadrupled under the previous Conservative government in the space of just 4 years. Those numbers need to come down. We do believe we should support young people across this country, including through youth prevention partnerships.
Deirdre Costigan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Exactly 2 weeks ago today, Darius Seraphin tragically died from a knife wound on the streets of West Ealing, on a road long blighted by antisocial behaviour that I had written to the police about just the week before. How will the government's new respect orders and crackdown on knives help bring reassurance to my constituents in West Ealing?
I'm very sorry to hear about the incident that my honourable friend refers to, and she will know that we have a commitment to halve knife crime over the course of the next decade. We've already introduced the ban on zombie knives and machetes. We're on our way to moving forward on the ban on ninja swords. And last week, as the Home Secretary announced, the new measures under Ronan's law to tighten the lethal loopholes in the online sale of knives. And we're developing the Young Futures programme with prevention partnerships at their heart to stop young people getting involved in knife crime.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Kia McNichol, is a mother to 4 children. Her 3-year-old Patrick was recently diagnosed with cancer. Kia's mother-in-law recently applied for a visa extension so that she can help her family with childcare through these most terrific of circumstances. Her application was rejected. Forgive me, Mr. Speaker, but I cannot tell the difference between this Labour government and the Tories who came before them. Will the Minister therefore commit to looking at this application again so that our constituent can focus on what matters most, the health of our son?
I thank the honourable member for his question. If he wants to write to me on that case, I'm very happy to look at it.
Alex Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Eni and Meany were 2 white cats from Stanbridge who were recently shot and killed. Could the Minister outline what discussions she has had with local police to ensure that these crimes are properly investigated and that the law is upheld?
Well, the abuse of animals using weapons of any type is an incredibly serious matter, and there are provisions in the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981, the Wild Mammals Protection Act 1996, and the Animal Welfare Act 2006. There's a range of offences there, and I would encourage anyone who witnesses this kind of event to report it to the police, and I will certainly be discussing with my colleagues in DEFRA about what more we can do.
Maguire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of my constituents have raised concerns about e-bikes and e-scooters being a safety hazard when they've been modified or they're misused. What is the Minister doing to tackle riders travelling at high speeds on pavements and within pedestrian areas to help my constituents feel safe on their streets again?
I can reassure the honourable member that the dangerous and antisocial behaviour involving e-bikes will also be covered by the legislation that we will be bringing in to be introduced tomorrow to tackle vehicles and off-road bikes used in antisocial behaviour so that we can keep streets and communities safe.
To Patrick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Antisocial behaviour is too common on the Wirral and it ruins lives. This morning I spoke to my constituent Henry and he told me how it has made him feel like a prisoner in his own home, having groups of youths hanging outside, intimidating, threatening and damaging property. Can I ask the Home Secretary what more can be done to tackle this abuse and to support the victims?
My honourable friend is right to raise this because too often antisocial behaviour is treated, is dismissed as a sort of low-level crime, and yet it can make people's lives a complete misery. That's why we need more neighbourhood police back on our streets working in communities in order to prevent and tackle the kinds of problems communities face.
Blake Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister recently said he was, and I quote, hardwiring growth into all decisions of the Cabinet. How did he react when the Home Secretary told him that her policy on electronic travel authorisations would cost the economy nearly £735 million over 5 years?
I thank the honourable member for his question. We are introducing it as in line with the approach of our international partners, also like Australia and the USA, who have also been looking at how we can make sure that we enhance our ability to pre-screen travellers upstream and stop those who pose a threat from travelling to the UK. It's the former Immigration Minister and now Secretary of State for Justice who said at the time that ETAs will enhance our border security by increasing our knowledge about those who seek to come and prevent the arrival of those who pose a threat. If he disagreed with him, I suggest they might have a catch-up about it, and perhaps the party opposite will have worked out by then where it stands on this policy, an initiative that started after them.
Mr. Speaker, in recent years, the UK has slid down the international league table on tackling corruption. Given the threat of corruption to our democracy, our economy and our national security, can my right honourable friend say whether the government intend to publish a new comprehensive anti-corruption strategy?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for the work that he does with the APPG. I can confirm that this government takes the broader threat of corruption, illicit finance and kleptocracy extremely seriously. This is why we've announced that we'll publish a new UK anti-corruption strategy this year. The new strategy will include measures that make it harder for corrupt actors to operate, strengthen global resilience to corruption and address the UK's vulnerabilities to corruption, including ways to ensure that all those in public service are held to the highest standards.
James Cleverley.
The Home Secretary knows that raising the minimum income threshold has reduced net migration, which is why I introduced it as when I was Home Secretary. If she wants to continue bringing net migration down, will she now confirm that she will introduce the further increases to the thresholds in the future, as I had proposed to do?
Home Secretary.
Net migration quadrupled during the period while the former Home Secretary was in government. In the space of just 4 years, the most shocking loss of control of our borders, including we saw visas and overseas recruitment shoot up at exactly the same time as training here in the UK fell. That is why this government will set out a white paper which sets out measures to reduce net migration, including making sure that employers recruit and train here in the UK.
Joe Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Friday night, I joined Bedford police officers on a ride-along to see first-hand the great work they do helping vulnerable people. However, the Policing Minister knows that Bedfordshire Police rely heavily on specific grants to tackle serious, violent and organised crime. Will she be able to confirm that these grants will be continuing and when we might be able to hear?
Well, can I just say that I visited Bedfordshire Police before Christmas, and I agree they're an excellent force, and decisions around funding will be made in due course.
Tim Foran.
Mr Speaker, refugees here from Ukraine on the Homes for Ukraine scheme are not eligible to indefinite leave. They have a 3-year visa, which in many cases obviously is about to expire, and they have got a very short window to apply for what is only an 18-month extension. Does she agree with me that that is not long enough for Ukrainian families here to be able to plan their future, and will she reconsider?
I can say to the honourable member that we continue to support the Homes for Ukraine visa. It remains extremely important, and I have a family still living with me in Yorkshire from Ukraine, and we will continue to support it, and we will also continue to make sure that people are not disadvantaged by the deadlines that have been set.
Mr Osborne.
Thank you very much. Mr Speaker, challenging violence against women and girls is absolutely critical mission of this government. Can I ask, what work is the Minister doing with the Department for Education to promote positive role models in our schools and further education colleges?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and say I'm literally about to go into a cross-government ministerial meeting with the Department for Education about exactly that. Our violence against women and girls strategy will not succeed without the prevention of education.
Timothy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Home Secretary quite conspicuously failed to answer the question from my honourable friend, the member for Weald of Kent earlier, so I'm going to have another go. Should it ever be a criminal offence for anybody to desecrate a religious text, yes or no?
Well, the honourable member will know we don't have a blasphemy law in this country, nor will we have so.
Chris Webb.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. 3 weeks ago, I met a 9-year-old boy in Blackpool's Asylum Hotel. He cannot walk, has frequent seizures and is non-verbal. Since May last year, his family's been requesting a wheelchair because they have to carry him everywhere they go. No child, especially one with these needs, should have to go through the equipment that gives them the dignity to live. Does the Minister agree with me that hotels such as this is unsuitable for vulnerable children? And will she personally intervene to help you get this young lad a wheelchair?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And thank you for bringing this concern, this matter to my attention. My officials have investigated, and Serco has referred the case to healthcare partners who are currently in the process of providing a suitable wheelchair following a thorough assessment of the child's needs. Officials are monitoring the situation closely to ensure that the family receives the support they require.
Sir Olney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Domestic abuse services in my area are telling me there's a specific shortage of places in shelters for men, and that this is a particular problem for women who are fleeing domestic abuse with their teenage sons. Can I ask the Minister what's being done to address this problem specifically?
Refuge accommodation actually sits within the Department for Communities and Housing. However, we have invested £30 million extra for local councils to look at the need that they have in their local area, which includes creating dispersed accommodation to allow, because in group accommodation, women with older boys are often not allowed.
Luke Murphy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Last week I held a summit in the top of town with local businesses in Basingstoke to discuss how we can breathe new life into our town centre. One of the key messages that came across was that persistent antisocial behaviour was making residents feel unsafe and putting in a barrier in place for businesses to thrive. What reassurance can the Home Secretary give businesses and constituents in Basingstoke that this government is making progress in restoring town centre patrols?
My honourable friend is exactly right to raise this for Basingstoke and also for towns right across the country. Town centres have been blighted by a 60% increase in shop theft over the last 2 years before the election, as well as antisocial behaviour. That is why tackling town centre crime will be at the heart of the Crime and Policing Bill introduced tomorrow.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the Home Secretary agree with me that it would be a better use of Greater Manchester police officers' time if they actually policed the streets and prevented crime rather than visiting grandmothers' homes to discuss a Facebook post?
Well, perhaps the honourable member missed the discussion about this earlier. We have been clear. Neighbourhood policing is the central priority for policing that this government has set to tackle town centre crimes, to tackle challenges across the country, and also to tackle serious violence, including violence against women and girls, and also including the knife crime, which is devastating young lives. Those are the priorities we have made clear to police forces right across the country as part of our policing reform and part of our new legislation.
Final question, Jonathan Brash.
Dispersed accommodation for asylum is unevenly distributed across the country. That's why in Hartlepool we are supporting 50 asylum seekers per 10,000 in the population, yet a few miles up the road in the neighbouring local authority it's 7 per 10,000, with local authorities elsewhere in the country hosting none. Does the Minister agree this is unfair, and as we bring the numbers down, we must evenly distribute the areas that support asylum seekers?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, we did inherit a very uneven distribution, if I could put it that way, of dispersed accommodation, often in poorer areas where their presence puts more pressure on local communities. It's not a situation we would have wanted to create, and it's one that we will want to remedy over time.
Right, that completes questions. We'll let front bench change over.